What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I'm going to share the 3 rules of late summer swim jig fishing. Let's get into it. Rule number 1 of late summer swim jig fishing is to match the hatch with your swim jigs. There's 3 combinations of jig and trailer I like to use, and I've actually started using a brand new jig from Core Tackle over the older style swim jig that I used to throw all the time, which is a striking hack attack jig. Great jig, great hook. It just has a pretty big head to it at the front, and we thought we could take the tush hook design and apply it to a swim jig, and that's what we did at Core Tackle, where we took all of the weight and put it down the shank of the swim jig hook, and that makes the head of that swim jig really small, so it comes through cover a lot better, as you can compare those 2 head sizes. And whenever you pair this swim jig also with a swim bait trailer, it gives that bait a lot more side to side rocking motion because that weight is inside the belly of the bait. In addition, we put that single cable guard weed guard on there as opposed to the brush guard, which actually promotes more side to side roll as well because there's not as much friction from that weed guard as it spins and turns. So you get a really cool action out of this bait. And this is actually a 3/8 ounce swim jig, and the head on that again is tiny because all that lead is down the shank of the bait. You have a nice big 4/0 hook in there. So I'm using this swim jig a lot now, and the few different variations I use to match the hatch are first this Goldilocks color whenever I'm trying to match shad in dirtier water. So if I'm fishing in relatively stained water, let's say 2 foot of visibility or less, and there's some bigger shad, whether that's bigger gizzard shad or some bigger threadfin shad. What I'll do is pair up that 3/8 ounce Core Tackle swim jig with a 4.75 X-Zone Swammer swim bait. This swim bait works great on that swim jig. It gives it that nice rolling action, and it's a pretty beefy profile for that swim jig. I'll throw this around a lot of shallow grass. I'll skip it around boat docks. I even fish it around some flatter rocky banks in Oklahoma. And whenever those fish are feeding on bigger shad, this is my go-to swim jig combination. Also, one thing I forgot to mention, with the weight being inside that swim bait and being on the shank of the hook, allows you to skip this jig way easier than your other standard swim jig that has all the head weight or all the weight on the head. With that weight distributed down the bait, you can skip this thing like crazy around shallow boat docks and things, which is awesome on Grand Lake in Oklahoma or any places like that where you want to fish a shad imitating bait back behind boat docks and tight, hard to reach places. So that's my first kind of match the hatch swim jig. But then my other option is when I actually start fishing in areas with smaller bait fish, whether that's smaller threadfin shad or just smaller bait fish profile in general, or when I'm fishing in clear water, let's say 3 to 4 feet of visibility. This is the new 2/0 1/4 ounce Core Tackle swim jig. It has a 2/0 hook, and to my knowledge, it's the only swim jig that I know on the market that has that 2/0 heavy duty hook that you can throw on a bait caster. And because that weight is down the shank of that hook, the head is absolutely tiny on this swim jig, and it fits perfectly with a little 2.8 or 3.3 Kitech style swim bait. This is a Big Bite Baits Pro Swimmer on the back. And this little tiny swim jig skips extremely well. It again has that nice body roll, just like the bigger size. And whenever those fish are feeding on smaller forage, you can skip this thing around boat docks, shallow grass. When the water's clear, you can just kind of cast it around shallow bushes and things like that as well and get a ton of bites. And it is one of my favorite new little baits, and probably my favorite bait we came out with this year from Core Tackle, just because there's really nothing else on the market like it. And a lot of guys have been giving us some great reports from this bait who've been throwing it. So again, the 2/0 1/4 ounce Core Tackle swim jig when you're trying to fish smaller bait fish around smaller bait fish, or you just are fishing in clear water. You can even thin out that skirt a little bit. I like to keep the skirt a little bit fuller just because I feel like it gives a little bit bigger profile to the bait, but you can take a lot of the strands out and make it really thin and just that swim bait with a little bit of skirt material, and you can throw it on a bait caster again and absolutely crush him. So that's kind of my other combo. And then my last match the hatch style swim jig is actually something I use when I'm trying to imitate crawfish or bluegill or brim. It kind of is a catch-all for those brim, bluegill, crawfish situations. And that's just a black and blue 3/8 ounce Core Tackle swim jig with a Strike King Menace grub. This is actually the larger size, so the bigger. I think it's the Magnum Menace grub. It's a little bit bigger size, and I'll also throw the Strike King Rage Craw on the back, but I've liked that Menace grub a little bit more with this core tackle swim jig because it skips really well, and I also like that contrast between the green pumpkin color and then the black and blue skirt. I thinned out this skirt a little bit by pulling some of the strands and a few of the tinsel out of the skirt, just so it has a little bit more kind of compact profile to it, a little bit thinner. And I will skip this thing around boat docks when the fish are feeding on brim. I will throw this in grass. I throw this all over the place. And you can also get a bunch of bites on the Strike King Rage Craw and again, the Strike King Hack Attack swim jig. I've just been throwing this swim jig because this is one that we make and it has been absolutely hammering them for me. So really, really cool deal there. And those are kind of the three match the hatch scenarios. Again, bigger gizzard shad and bigger shad in dirtier water. Use this setup. The 2/4 ounce core tackle swim jig with the small swim bait when you're fishing clear water and smaller forage, and then when you're fishing around brim, bluegill, crawfish, the 3/8 ounce black and blue with that Menace grub. That's what I like to throw. After matching the hatch with your swim jig, rule number 2 is find transition zones. Whenever you're fishing in the late summertime of the year, bass are going to start migrating from the main lake to the backs of the creeks. The reason they do this is because the forage in the form of bait fish like shad or alewife, golden shiner, things like that, are actually going to be migrating from the main lake back into the creeks. This usually happens because either the thermocline is disappearing on your lake or there's going to be some late fall rains, which is going to bring nutrients into the backs of creeks. Whenever you're fishing in that late summer time of the year then, you need to figure out where the transition routes are. Usually you can use creek channels, ditches, drains, things like that to help point you in the areas where the bass are actually going to be migrating, and you can use them almost as highways that feed the backs of these pockets, coves, bays, things like that. Along those creek channels and drains and ditches, there's going to be shallow water areas adjacent to them that have great cover where you can throw a swim jig. Usually I'm looking for a few different types of cover. The first is going to be some type of shallow vegetation, whether that's bank grass in the form of water willow, maybe some shallow offshore coontail or eelgrass, and sometimes you can even find some matted hydrilla and fish the edge of the hydrilla. You can also find fish sitting up around floating boat docks, whether that's a big marina or just some shallower boat docks in general. The bait fish are going to set up around the shade of the grass, around the shade of the boat docks. You can also find fish setting up around rock in the form of bluff walls, as well as riprap banks. Basically, any place where you have that shad, you have an opportunity to catch a lot of fish on a swim jig. And I always like to use a swim jig when that cover is relatively thick, or there is at least some type of area where those bass can set up to ambush shad that are in the area. So in the case of shallow water willow grass or eelgrass, those fish are going to be setting up in the grass and ambushing the shad that swim by the grass clumps or just down the bank around the water willow. Around the boat docks, the bass will set up in the shade of the boat docks, and you will bring that swim jig through the shade pockets, around the boat floats and things like that, and that's where you're going to find those bass. And then around riprap, you may find isolated bigger rocks. On a bluff wall, you might find a bigger boulder or a shallower spot that sticks up that's surrounded by deeper, kind of sharper drop-offs on each side. Either way, you can basically target these fish with a swim jig after matching that hatch, and you can catch a ton of really good fish. You can also find a lot of fish feeding on crawfish and bluegill or brim around these same boat docks and around the rock and around the grass, and those bluegill and brim will actually migrate, and those crawfish will also be a little bit active at times around this time of year. So there's a lot of different forage you can target, but mainly the shad are going to be what you're focused on because that's what is going to be the main driver of the bass migration in the late summertime. Now, once you kind of dial in some of the key types of cover that you want to be looking for, you need to figure out which section of the creek the bass are actually setting up in. Are they more towards the main lake? Are they halfway back in the creek? Or are they almost to the back of the creek where you basically need to fish super shallow water? Once you know what type of cover you're looking for along these migration routes, you need to figure out how far back the bass have actually transitioned into the creeks. Early in the late summertime, let's say August, early September, fish are going to be more towards the main lake or the first half of the creeks. As you get later into September, those fish are going to be more in the kind of first half to maybe the middle of the creeks. And then as you transition into the late summertime, I guess like early October, when it's still a little bit warm, not super cold yet, those fish will be like right dead in the middle of the creek or maybe even a little bit further back into the creeks than that. The way you can identify how far the bass have moved back into the creeks is one, look where you see the most bait fish activity, which you can determine just by seeing shad kicking on the shoreline. You can look for blue heron or birds that are on the bank, and you can also just fish through some of these areas and see where you're getting the most bites. There's a lot of ways you can determine it, but you definitely want to pay attention to which section of the creek you're in, because a lot of times the fish are going to be just in that like first half of the creek, maybe 100 or 200 yard stretch, and then you can fish the rest of the creek and catch nothing, but you can run every single first half or first 100 yards of the creek and catch them all throughout the lake in that same little stretch. The same thing applies on river systems actually. It's kind of interesting. On a river system like the Arkansas River, the shad are going to migrate up and down the main river channel and into the mouths of some of these creeks, and you'll find that there's maybe a 1 mile stretch of a 10-mile pool on the Arkansas River that has the most shad. You can fish jetties, you can fish water willow, you can fish riprap banks with that swim jig and catch a ton of fish. And really just find those areas that are choked out with shad or that have a good shad presence, and that's where you're going to find the majority of your bass. Finally, rule number 3 of late summer jig fishing is you can't fish too shallow. What I mean by this is that a lot of fish in that late summer time that are going to eat a swim jig are going to be sometimes in a foot of water or less. I catch a lot of fish on the Arkansas River, on Grand Lake in Oklahoma, and other places where I throw a swim jig, where I can actually sometimes see the fins of the fish out of the water. They're that shallow. And a lot of times those fish are going to be setting up almost as far as you can get your bait to the shore, whether that is on the backside of shallow water willow, on the inside grass line, on boat docks, floating boat docks, where they'll actually be on the walkways, and it'll be right where the bank and the walkway start, like this little tiny sliver of water that looks like couldn't hold any fish. You skip a jig underneath there and you can catch a lot of good fish up right where the walkway starts. So you definitely can't fish too shallow this time of year with a swim jig. Same thing applies if you're fishing around shallow lily pads. A lot of times I'll catch fish way back into the lily pads, like against the bank, or maybe some reeds and lily pads meet and it's like 6 inches of water. I'm digging up mud with my trolling motor, and you just have to get super shallow this time of year a lot of times to catch fish. It's very interesting because you would think with these warmer temperatures still, those fish would want to be deep, but something about the oxygen levels and the way the bait fish migrate, a lot of those fish will be super shallow. And even if they're not shallow in terms of like being in like a foot of water, a lot of times they're going to be within a foot of the surface. So what I would recommend when you're fishing a swim jig is try to keep it within a foot of the surface, keep it high in the water column, which is something you can do easily around shallow water willow, where you swim it right in the top of the grass. Same thing with eelgrass or around a grass mat, swim it really high in the water column, just under the surface. And if you're fishing floating boat docks, if you're not getting bit on the walkways themselves, you can catch fish underneath the bigger floats that might be sitting over 15 or 20 feet of water, but the fish are just gonna be a foot down, just barely under the floats or under some of the floating pontoons or whatever you have there. And you can skip that jig underneath the boat dock and just swim it right underneath the surface, and they'll come up and eat that swim jig. I rarely fish my swim jigs deep, or when I say deep, I normally don't fish them deeper than like a foot of water in the late summer, or other times of the year, especially like in the post-spawn time of the year, I'll actually fish that swim jig pretty deep. I'll let it get down to that like 5-6 foot of water range, and I'll even do that when we get into the fall as well. So the strategy kind of changes as the fish begin to set up in different seasons of the year, water temperatures change. But at least in the late summer, those fish are going to be very high in the water column and very shallow. So don't be afraid to fish shallow. If you think you're fishing too shallow, go a little bit shallower sometimes, because that's where a lot of anglers will not go. And I've caught a lot of fish, even just fishing a swim jig on like flat rocky banks in Oklahoma, where you'll get a couple like bigger pieces of chunk rock or a little rock transition, and I'll throw the swim jig right here with that paddle tail swim bait on the back, and you just reel it really, really shallow, and they'll come up and choke this thing. So don't be afraid to fish really shallow in that late summer time of the year. It's one of those few times of the year where you can cover a lot of water really fast, and you kind of have to because the fish will be spread out. They're migrating, and not all the fish are setting up in like one spot at once. The migration kind of spreads those fish out in the late summertime, so you have to cover a lot of water to get those fish in the boat. So fish shallow, check some of the areas talked about in those transition zones, and match the hatch with your swim jig. And make sure you check out these new core tackle swim jigs if you haven't already. We are wanting to get these to be a bestseller on Tackle Warehouse, and we have all of our other core tackle baits a bestseller right now. So if you guys would head over and pick up some of these swim jigs, it would really help us out, and it'd be cool to have all of our baits as bestsellers on Tackle Warehouse. So thanks for checking out this video, guys, and we'll see you on the next one.